Well, good evening, everybody. Glad that you've joined us again. I'm doing a couple things differently this evening. You may have just seen the camera adjust as the video started. I'm trying a different approach with sound, trying to correct some of the echo and background stuff. So I guess we'll see how this recording goes, and either we'll like the outcome or we won't. But one of the things that I try to do with some of our tech stuff is just try other options every once in a while and see if there's a way to do this that I've been missing, or to improve it in some form or another. So your feedback is always appreciated. Helps me know what we need to take a look at because, I mean, believe it or not, I don't go back and watch every single minute of every single video that we put together between this class, Sunday class, live stream. It just adds up to a lot of time watching stuff, so I don't get a chance to do that. So if there's something that you're noticing, you can go ahead and probably take a guess that I haven't. So I appreciate the feedback that we get along the way. We're continuing on in the Gospel of Matthew. We are still in chapter 15 tonight. Verses 29 through 39 are kind of what we are taking a look at. And we get a really interesting story this evening because it is something we've seen before. And the way the story goes feels very familiar, and yet there are some notable differences worth paying attention to. So I guess without further delay, we just go ahead and dive right into Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 through 39. By reminder of where we've been, if you've either not watched the last couple of videos and you're jumping into the middle, or it's been a week and you've either slept or not slept since then and just need a quick refresher. The last couple of weeks we've gotten some really, I love the way the stories just kind of build on each other to help make this point. And so the last three things that we've looked at are Peter's faith and then doubt and the swim that he takes afterwards. And then an argument really, between Jesus and the Pharisees about where true purity comes from, keeping ritual purity laws or from the heart. And then we get a really intriguing story with a Gentile woman, where by the end of the story, it's her faith that's being celebrated. And so you kind of see the descent of faith, Peter from trust to doubt, and then this conversation with the Pharisees about really about who's in and who's out. I think that's a much bigger image than the words on their own suggest. And then this turn to this outsider, this Gentile woman, and her faith in the end being celebrated. And so we finish up that last one taking place in a non-Jewish region that Jesus goes to intentionally. An important theme in Matthew's gospel is the inclusion of Gentiles. And we've been talking about that a lot along the way. So all of that kind of to this passage this evening. And I'm going to do something this evening that I don't do a ton of in these series, where I'm actually going to bring up Mark's telling of this passage as well, because I think what Matthew does is hint at what Mark says more directly. So there's some intention there that's really hard for us to pick up on, especially when those details like location don't necessarily mean nearly as much to us as they would in the first century world. All right, Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 through 39. Jesus returned to the Sea of Galilee and climbed a hill and sat down. A vast crowd brought to him people who were lame, blind, crippled, those who couldn't speak, and many others. They laid them before Jesus, and he healed them all. The crowd was amazed. Those who hadn't been able to speak were talking. The crippled were made well. The lame were walking. The blind could see again. And they praised the God of Israel. Then Jesus called his disciples and told them, "I feel sorry for these people. They've been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. I don't want to send them away hungry, or they'll faint along the way." The replied, "Where would we get enough food here in the wilderness for such a huge crowd? How much bread do you have?" They replied, 7 loaves and a few small fish." So Jesus told all the people to sit down on the ground, and then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, thanked God for them, and broke them into pieces. He gave them to the disciples, who distributed the food to the crowd. They all ate as much as they wanted. And afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were 4,000 men who were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. Then Jesus sent the people home, and he got on a boat and crossed over to the region of Magadan. So, again, this is not the first healing story in Matthew's gospel. This is not the first feeding story in Matthew's gospel. This is round 2 on feeding of a large number of people. And it seems strange to me that the disciples' response, when put in the exact same position, isn't to immediately go, oh, we have plenty. We have a few loaves and we're good. Like, that's great. They instead offer some concern about whether or not they have enough, how all of those people could possibly be fed, which brings some questions for us and has challenged readers of Matthew's gospel for a very long time on either how the disciples could possibly not understand, at least that Jesus has the ability to do this by this point, or whether or not this is really the same story told again in a different way, with the intent of making a different point and highlighting some of those theological concerns that I've talked about Matthew having all along the way. And the simple answer is we don't know. I've said several times before, Matthew does not write chronologically. He writes theologically. It is very much inside the realm of possibility. Tell the same story in a different way. Mark certainly does the exact same thing. He shares this story twice. Although, and here's why I wanted to talk about the differences in Mark a little bit. Mark, this story, the second feeding, takes place explicitly in Gentile territory. Mark is emphatic that these are Gentiles that Jesus is working with. In Matthew, it is way more subtle, where Jesus has been in Gentile territory. He's now coming back to the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is not explicitly Jewish or Gentile. There's part of the area that is predominantly Jewish. There's part of the seashore that is in the Decapolis, predominantly Gentile. And Matthew does not tell us where. The one clue that we would get to this location, which would have been clearly understood by Matthew's audience that we completely have nothing to go for, is the final verse notes that after this takes place, then Jesus crosses over to an area known as Magadan, which clue where that's at. There's been some guesses that Magadan is on the Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, which would then place this story on the Gentile side, and I think that's how we're meant to read this, even if Matthew is hiding it a little bit, because of how central that inclusion of Gentiles is to Matthew's message. And you'll notice if you read through that, on a few occasions, Matthew uses a word that emphasizes that this is for everyone. My translation chooses all. It's not just they, it's not just some, but it's all who are present, who experience this, who are fed, who are healed, who are there, and that opens the idea that this is not a limited group, that it's not restricted to a handful, but that it's meant for all. The other thing that we don't necessarily catch on first read, but is definitely there, is if you know your Old Testament prophets, especially if you know Isaiah, and you can go Isaiah 35 to see this. This is another one of those moments where the actions of Jesus point us directly back to prophetic hope that speaks of a coming Messiah. And when the prophets imagine the coming Messiah, what they speak of is one who is going to heal and care for. There's very often shepherd image, which Matthew will use that too. They were like sheep without a shepherd, is how Jesus views the crowds leading up to, the Sermon on the Mount. And then you get the image very often used for the triumph of God is that of a messianic banquet. Banquets being important in the ancient world, food always being something that draws people together, food also being something in Jewish tradition that sets people apart. And yet, when the prophets speak of the coming Messiah, it is a gathering of all nations to God. It starts with Jerusalem, it starts with Israel, it starts with the Jewish community, but it inevitably brings in Gentiles, non-Jews, to that community as well. All come to the mountain of God as one of those images and ideas that comes directly from the prophets. And so I think we're meant to hear echoes of that when we get this story from Matthew, this image of Jesus going to a mountain. My translation chooses hill, but that's not how the original language is really trying to picture this. Jesus is on a high place near the seashore, and people come to him, and he heals and feeds. That's very much a messianic image from the prophets, and one way in which we see Jesus fulfilling. Remember, if you've been with me from the beginning on these classes, the idea of Jesus being the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise is one of those images, those ideas that Matthew really, really pushes his first readers to understand. And so here, with a crowd made up of all, a people come together and are formed and are cared for and experience this messianic banquet. And one of the other things that I find interesting in this story is that in the beginning, Jesus asks how much bread. The disciples offer bread and fish. Jesus distributes bread and fish. But what Jesus talks about in the end, when he asks them what's left, he comes back to bread. The fish doesn't seem to be a concern for Jesus at all. And I think this is, again, one of those things that Matthew is emphasizing because, of course, what sits in front of the early church every time they share a meal is this notion of breaking bread together. The small messianic banquet that they celebrate each and every time they get together in the early church. Communion, where the bread is what brings them together, what they share in common. And so the emphasis that Matthew has here is not on fish, it's not on the unsymbolic. I don't know that that's a real phrase, but we're going to roll with it anyway. But it's on the symbolic, on the important, on the bread. And then the other thing that is definitely worth paying attention to in Matthew's telling of the story here is the number of baskets left over at the end is 7. Previously, it was 12 in chapter 14. And the telling of the feeding of the 5,000. Here, the feeding of the 5,000, we have 7 baskets of leftovers. And the reason that 7 is important, and we don't necessarily do like numerical symbology in the modern world. Aside from, us treating 13 like it's an unlucky number, we don't put much stock in what numbers mean. In the ancient world, that would not have been the case. They would put a lot of stock in what numbers mean. There's an entire ancient practice that's gematology. I know I'm mispronouncing that, but it's not all that important how I pronounce it. The idea is what matters, and it's that numbers carry meaning. They're deeply symbolic. There's a reason that the book of Revelation relies heavily on numbers in its symbolism. And here is another one of those where 7 symbolizes wholeness, completeness, fullness, or fulfilledness in this case. Where what Jesus is doing is completing, making whole something that's out there. And so for Matthew's readers, for Jesus' crowd, for the disciples, who see this number that's speaking to the wholeness, the completeness, the fullness of God in Christ, of Jesus' ministry, of what God is doing. And then there was something else that I wanted to hit on, and I forgot to write it down. And so if you'll provide me just a second to quickly flip through what I've underlined and starred and marked to make sure that I cover what I want to cover for this evening. There we go. I didn't write it down, but I remembered. The other thing that I think is important about there being two feedings in Matthew is because Matthew is so very concerned with Jesus in line with the ongoing historic work of God. And so for the people of Israel in the moment of the Exodus, both the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, two stories where there's this mass of feeding of the people. If you look at Elijah, there are two feeding stories. And of course, we know, if you've read through Matthew before, that there's this moment of the transfiguration, is what we typically call it, where Jesus is on a mountainside with Moses and with Elijah, two people who are so important in Jewish thought, in Jewish history, in Jewish theology. So important in the thought and theology of basically everyone of Jesus' day, and of the early church, especially those who were Jewish. There's great importance there. And so here are, two people from their past, from their story, who fed twice, and here's a way that Jesus does, the same thing, only more so. They feed, Jesus has leftovers. They guide, Jesus, again, it's this idea that Jesus is similar to the prophets before him. Jesus is very much like the work that God has done before. In this case, only more so, only greater, only bigger, only fuller, to the point where Matthew uses these images to communicate to his audience and to us that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that God has done, is doing, and will do. This is the fullness of the promise and work of God present in front of them. And Matthew would add, Mark does too, that this is for everyone. This is for Jews and Gentiles. This is the coming together of all nations at the mountain of God as promised by those before. Maybe it's not everybody in the temple at Zion, but that does not make it any less true. It doesn't make it any less real that it's what God is doing. And so there's this understanding that Matthew, especially for his predominantly Jewish audience who's struggling hard to figure out where they fit in all of this, to try and help them understand that Jesus is the fullness of God, that Jesus' work to include Gentiles is intentional and purposeful and of God, and this is what the prophets were pointing to, and so this is worth trusting in. And I think that's another reason why the disciples struggle to trust along the way is so important, because they get there, right? We know that in spite of their fears and doubts and fleeing at the moment of the cross and all of those things, we know that the church continues, that the church grows, that these people become important leaders in the church. So the struggle, the doubt along the way, in spite of obvious evidence, right? They've been here before. How do they not believe? Does not mean that they're worthless or unworthy of God's love, of God's work. And so the same is true for the readers of this gospel. You may struggle, you may doubt, but that doesn't mean there's any less a place for you. The disciples are also learning. For the story that we have of the second feeding here in Matthew 15, they may not instantly say, here's the bread we've got, Jesus, get to it, but they do at least know how much is on hand. The first time we have a mass feeding, they don't even know what the resources are. So maybe that's growth. And maybe it's helpful for us to understand that as growth. It's not that you go from point A to point B overnight, from pure doubt to unwavering trust. But maybe the biggest difference is that today you don't even know what the resources are, and you definitely don't think Jesus can do it. And tomorrow maybe you're a little less baffled and you at least know what's there, even if you're still not sure how it's going to work. So I think all of those are kind of important images for us. All right, I think I've covered everything that I was expecting to cover. And I'll go ahead and call it. We will pick up with Matthew chapter 16 when we get together on Wednesday of next week. And we're back to others who struggle to believe. Pharisees who are demanding a sign and want proof. And, contrasting that with all of these people who are coming out of desperation in the hope that Jesus can. Contrasting them and the Pharisees is a real interesting thing that Matthew is doing, because it challenges the notion of tradition. And we'll talk more about that next week. All right, glad you were with us. I'll catch you next time around.